Now I will explain to you some learning theory vocabulary. I will give you the definitions as well as some examples. The first term is contiguous, which means at the same time or very close in time. When Pavlov was conditioning his dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell, he had to present the bell and the food at the same time or very close in time, and that's called contiguously. In order for the dogs to learn that the bell meant that it was time for food and for those associations to form, those stimuli had to be presented contiguously. The next term is extinction, which means when a learned response fades away. So now, if Pavlov stopped presenting the food when he rang the bell, the dogs would eventually learn, oh, I guess the bell doesn't mean food anymore. And then that salivation response would fade away. And we would say the salivation response has been extinguished. Now, I do want to explain that this term extinction, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because most people, when they hear this term, they think of the dinosaurs or they think of animals that have gone extinct. And in that context, it means forever. The dinosaurs are never coming back, they've gone extinct. But when we use this term in the context of learning theory, extinction means something a little bit different because the learned response is not necessarily gone forever. The learned response can return. So it's a little bit different. In fact, the flip side of extinction is spontaneous recovery. And that's when an extinguished learned response reoccurs. So if Pavlov conditioned the dogs to salivate at the sound of the bell, then he stops presenting the food, so that salivation response is extinguished. But then now he reintroduces the food at the sound of the bell, then it's very likely that the salivation response will return in the dogs. And we call that spontaneous recovery. An example of these terms, let's say in the wild. So picture some elephants, living in Africa, and they always go to a particular watering hole. But there's a drought, and so there hasn't been any rain for a long time, and the watering hole dried up. So now the elephants, they stop going to this watering hole. So we would say that that response has been extinguished. But then they finally get some rain, and so the watering hole has water in it again. So what will happen? The elephants will start to go back to that watering hole. So then we would say, oh, spontaneous recovery has occurred. All right, this term here, generalization, applying a learned response to a similar situation. For this example, let's think about Watson's work with little Albert. So we know that Watson conditioned little Albert to be afraid of rats. But did you know that little Albert was not only afraid of rats, but that he generalized that fear to anything furry? So, like a woman walked into Watson's lab wearing a fur coat, and little Albert was afraid. Or in the literature, the stories say that little Albert even was afraid of Santa Claus because of his white beard and the fur on his coat. So that's an example of generalization where you apply a learned response to a similar situation. Or another example is with language acquisition. So if you've been around little kids when they're starting to learn how to talk, you might have seen something like this, like a little kid might learn the word doggy. But then at first, every furry four-legged friend is a doggy. So the little kid might see a cat and call the cat a doggy, or he sees a cow and he calls the cow a doggy. So that's an example of generalization where the child is just applying a learned response again to a similar situation. Then the flip side of generalization is discrimination, and that's where you can distinguish between similar learned responses. So an example of that could be if you happen to have a dog and you might have noticed that your dog, only gets excited at the sound of, someone from your family, the sound of their car coming up into the driveway. When your friend comes to visit, the dog does not get excited at the sound of your friend's car because the dog can discriminate between the sounds of the cars. So that's an example of discrimination. Or one more example could be in human babies. So, studies have found that a 3-day-old baby can, in a room full of female voices, that baby can distinguish between those voices, and that baby knows which of those voices belongs to their mother. And the baby will turn his or her head in the direction of their mother's voice in a room full of female voices. So that's another example of discrimination. So, in sum, in terms of learning, when the situation calls for us to generalize, we seem to instinctively know to do that. When the situation calls for us to discriminate, we know how to do that. And so these are some important terms for you to know, and I'm going to end it here.